Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to the June edition of our Cornerstone webinars. My name is Justin Goddard, and I serve as a Program Officer for National Leadership and Education here at Community Progress. Cornerstone is our monthly webinar series that equips participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. For today's Cornerstone, we are joined by both Matt Perkins and Bess Earl. Matt Perkins serves as a Senior Program Officer at LISC Safety Justice, is an expert in community-based crime reduction efforts, and advocate for resident-based crime prevention. Since joining LISC in 2013, his work has included supporting community-based approaches to reducing crime and increasing safety through collaborative problem solving. He has been a lead technical assistance provider on the U.S. Department of Justice Innovations and Community-Based Crime Reduction Program, and a trainer for local LISC partners. Prior to working with LISC, Matt was a technical assistance provider for the Federal Weed and Seed Crime Prevention Program, provided crime reduction support to HUD and public housing agencies nationwide, and worked at DOJ's Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services. Bess Earl serves as a program officer at Milwaukee LISC and is responsible for ensuring the strategic alignment of neighborhood investment and development with existing planned law enforcement initiatives in the city of Milwaukee. Most recently, Bess served as the director of the Washington Park Partners Sustainable Communities, where she oversaw neighborhood revitalization strategies. At the same time, she was the Burn Criminal Justice Innovation Coordinator for United Methodist Children's Services. Through a partnership team which included neighborhood residents, the Milwaukee Police Department, and local agencies, this program targeted hotspots of violent and serious crime and employed data-driven cross-sector strategies resulting in the reduction of violent crime in the Washington Park community. Before turning it over to our speakers, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your browser and send it to both the webinar host and all panelists. Finally, if you experience any technical difficulties, please use the chat box to message the Community Progress host or send an email to Justin Goddard at jgoddard@communityprogress.net. And with that, I turn it over to Matt.
Thank you, Justin. And also thank you to the Center for Community Progress for allowing us to talk a little bit about our work at LISC Safety and Justice and to talk about, wrong way on the slide, there we go, community partnerships for sustainable crime prevention and our work in developing long-term solutions to entrenched crime problems. Right. For those of you who aren't familiar with LISC, Local Initiative Support Corporation, that's the last time we say that. LISC is a national nonprofit that supports development efforts that empower people, transform places, support local economies, and foster leadership and innovation. Originally founded in 1979 as a community development finance institution, LISC's work focuses on providing support to local partners. LISC does not do the local support by and large, but we work with local organizations such as community development corporations to remake places. We provide funding, provide technical assistance and support when we can, and help with capacity building and support policy initiatives that promote development work. We have a number of special programs. We invite you to come take a look at our website and see those at lisc.org, but one that you may be interested in since it's about remaking places is a NFL Foundation Grassroots Initiative, which works to support quality, safety, and accessibility to playing fields in NFL-related markets. There is an open solicitation through August 30th. It's not available everywhere. But if you want to go to the NFL Foundation Grassroots webpage on the LISC website, you can take a look at that. Over the past 20 years, the foundation has provided over $46 million supporting 366 projects. LISC now has 35 metropolitan area offices across the country. When I first submitted this PowerPoint to Justin, it said 34. And we're growing rapidly, especially in the South and Southeast. So at the moment we have 35 offices, but we are growing. Our rural program serves more than 2,100 counties in 45 states, so we do have a national footprint. We're able to work in lots of places. LISC Safety and Justice was founded in 1994. We've provided grants, training, and technical assistance to 75 plus cities in that time with the aim of reducing crime, reducing blight, building stronger collective voices for residents, increasing collaboration between community and local law enforcement, increasing and increased sharing of tools and lessons learned. We're currently a national training and technical assistance provider to the U.S. Department of Justice for the Innovations in Community-Based Crime Reduction Program, CBCR, which supports sites in developing collaborative responses to specific crime problems in high crime communities. And the work under this grant program tries to develop collaborative approaches that address long-standing crime issues with attention to 4 pillars, the pillars of using data and research to address problems, community engagement, collaborative problem solving, and sustainability, and specifically development as a tool for sustainability. So why does an organization like LISC play such a role in safety? We like to focus in our work on the ideas of situational crime prevention. And if you see the crime triangle on this slide, it addresses kind of a basic need for crime reduction, that you can impact crime through addressing offenders, victims, but too often we forget that you can address the place or the environment that allows a crime to take place. With LISC's focus on remaking places in communities that experience disproportionate amount of crime, we like to bring place into the equation because it works, and because by concentrating on place, it allows for better work between community members, community organizations, and police. By eliminating the sole focus on people, it provides a framework and focus that allows for collective problem solving. Some of the other place-based issues that we often hear about and try to address in our work is the myth of displacement, the idea that, well, if you stop crime here, it just goes somewhere else. It's probably the most studied piece of criminology. When we do prevent crime, does it go away or does it go somewhere else? And almost universally, the answer is a lot of the crime just goes away because, again, you're addressing that place element of what makes a crime able to happen. Recent research shows that there's a difference between proximal or distal, i.e. near or far displacement, and it's something that to our listeners will just make sense. Some types of crime happen because there's an opportunity and it's easy for people to do it. Crimes like if you see something that's easy to take, you steal it, right, in some cases. But some types of crimes, there's much higher motivation levels for. So a heroin addict, for example, if you remove his or her ability to get heroin at one location, they're going to work very hard to get it at another. But also in terms of displacement, what we find consistently, and this is supported by research, is that when you make a place better, the places around it get better too, the diffusion of benefits. We talk a lot about the idea of broken windows, which many people will recognize the term, and there are a lot of different reactions to it. The concept is simply that the organization of a community and how a community looks sends messages to those in it about what types of activity will be allowed. So a neighborhood with lots of blight, with lots of disorder, is more likely to have crime in it. And in the past 15 to 20 years, a number of police agencies have pursued broken windows strategies of policing. What we're finding is that the idea of imposing a broken windows strategy from outside as an institutional actor doesn't really work. What works is when a community takes care of itself, and community members, for example, out sweeping the sidewalks, picking up litter, those are the communities that protect themselves from crimes. And so when we're able to address blight in conjunction with community members, we find that the impacts expand. And another tool that we use is crime prevention through environmental design. It's really a theory and practice that recognizes that the way a place is set up can encourage or reduce crime. And so by impacting just the physical layout of a space, you can have positive long-term safety consequences. Another issue in terms of placing crime is the idea of concentration of crime, and the idea of, and I'm using air quotes as I talk, even though nobody can see me, bad neighborhoods. The map and picture that you're seeing is from the Liberty City area of Miami-Dade County, somewhere that a lot of people would characterize as a bad neighborhood, quote unquote. But what we consistently find is even in those neighborhoods which are tagged as bad neighborhoods or considered high crime areas, crime takes place in a very limited number of places. So what you see is the highlighted map in red are the hot spots within the neighborhood for crime. Yellow areas have some crime, and the clear areas have little to no crime. And this is a common pattern that even in the most crime-prone neighborhoods, issues tend to be very localized, and that lends itself to problem solving by being able to look at what is it about these spaces that makes them more prone to crime, and how do we address that? How do we fix not a whole neighborhood, but an individual intersection, maybe a street segment, maybe a single address that has for years and years, sometimes for decades, been host to a disproportionate amount of crime. Again, we're just beginning to understand the role of placing crime. It's not something that's been studied extensively, but is starting to. The law of crime concentration, thinking about 80-20 rule, which is that in any given place, you'll have heard of high-impact offenders, where 80% of crimes can be attributed to 20% of people. Well, that rule holds true for places as well, where 80% of calls can generally, or crimes can generally be attributed to about 20% of the places at which crimes are taking place. Co-location with other problems, with the development of GIS and mapping technologies for data analysis, what we found is that if you are to map out crime and compare those to other social issues that need to be addressed, it's the same places. the early and most famous rule, or early and most famous study coming out of the Philadelphia area shows that an almost exact overlay between crime problem areas and areas which have high impact users of healthcare systems. Benefits of green spaces, an accidental study of Cabrini Green in Chicago shows that in individual buildings where green spaces were not paved over or replaced with concrete had less crime around them than individual buildings which had more pavement around them. We found that just the simple act of greening individual vacant lots can reduce crime, not just on that lot, but in the surrounding areas. The Pennsylvania Horticultural Society has an extensive program in Philadelphia of greening vacant lots, and what they'll do is mow the grass, plant some trees, get rid of weeds, clean up litter, and put this very, very short ornamental fencing around it. And just that act can reduce crime, not only in that specific lot, but in the neighborhood surrounding it. We've found that patterns of crime mimic the spread of infectious disease from a geographic pattern standpoint. There's some indication that pollution may be able to cause crime, including a recent study out of Chicago that showed that on days in which air quality was worse, crime rates went up. How do we operationalize collective efficacy and social cohesion? Collective efficacy being a term to reflect the concept, basically, that you trust your neighbors and feel that they have your best interests in your best interests at their in their heart. A typical question used to measure collective efficacy is, if your neighbor was in trouble, would you do something about it, like call the police? Social cohesion, the attachment to your community. Do you use local parks? Do you shop locally? Do you use local resources like a library? And can development be a crime prevention tool? Our research suggests that yes, it can. So this is why LISC Safety and Justice gets involved in crime prevention issues. This is why LISC views it as an important part of your mission, because impacting the place, impacting a community space can have a profound impact on the safety and welfare, and have tremendous benefits in reducing crime in a community. What does it look like? I'm going to quickly go through a couple examples of our work from the past and let you see. This is going to be very quick, so please, after this webinar, reach out to us if you have more questions or want to discuss anything further. The first example I'm going to give you is from Olneyville. It's a neighborhood in Providence, Rhode Island. A decade ago, the Olneyville neighborhood was recognized locally as the place you didn't want to be. Especially as you look at the map, there's a blank space towards the bottom of the highlighted area. That's along a local river. There were concerns about violence, drug use, and other types of crime, but it was the place you didn't go to, especially along Aleppo Street, which bordered that vacant area, and that vacant area was this. It was a disused industrial area, again, bordering a river. Working with the local Rhode Island LISC office, Providence Police Department, and other local development partners, LISC was able to focus on the Olneyville area around Aleppo Street as a redevelopment priority. What you see in the before picture on the left was referred to by Providence Police as the Blue House. It was a house known for drug distribution and generated an extraordinary amount of 911 calls for service. Working with our development partners, LISC was able to replace the Blue House with new development and affordable housing. So replacing what had been one of the worst, or if not the worst, spots in the neighborhood with some of the best. And working additionally with partners interested in forming a park, that abandoned industrial area became a riverfront park and center of community life. Even in developing the park and working with Providence Police Department, the bike path changed course from running directly adjacent to the river to running closer to the street going by, because the police department was able to make the observation that officers on patrol wanted a bike path that was close enough for them to see and reach through, because they really didn't have the opportunity, if they were going by the park, to stop and get out and walk all the way down to the river to check on things. So it can be as simple as just having the right people in the room to address and prevent crimes and make people who use a place like this feel safer. The success is pretty profound. If you look at that table, you'll see the two columns on the left. The blue line represents the percent of land area that the park, formerly the disused industrial area in the blue house, took up 7.8% of the land area in the police district, but were responsible for almost a quarter of the calls for service to police. After the intervention, you see that the number of percentage of police calls for service is actually less than the percent of land area in the neighborhood. Talking about a second example of how you can use space to address crime, and I want to talk today about the Alameda County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff's Office's initiative in Ashland and Cherryland. Ashland and Cherryland are unincorporated areas of Alameda County, so the Sheriff's Office has primary policing responsibility only in the unincorporated areas of the county. And they had a project that involved a cross-sector collaborative, including the Sheriff's Office, the Deputy Sheriff's Activities League, known athletically. Deputy Sheriff's Activities League, I really urge you to take a look at all the work they do. We can only talk about a tiny portion of it today, but you can look at their website at acdsal.org, and we'll put a link in there if the presentation is shared after, or you can contact me directly. My email address should be up here on the end. But the partnership included DSAL, the Alameda County Sheriff's Office, Bay Area LISC Office, LISC Safety Justice, ArtPlace America. The Urban Institute came in later as an evaluator, and they have an evaluation study that's posted online. Ashland-Cherryland Rising was a project funded in part by the U.S. Department of Justice, addressing the neighborhoods of Ashland and Cherryland, which is a largely renter population, pretty transient, a lot of people moving in and out, declining economic base. There's a commercial corridor in the neighborhood. A lot of the light industry and much of the retail has moved out in recent years, and it's a high crime area of the county. The Alameda County Sheriff's Office decided years ago that they were dealing with crime on the back end, both in terms of as a law enforcement agency responding to calls, but also as an agency that runs jails in the county. And they wanted to focus organizationally on tackling crime on the front end. How do we reduce crime so that we're less busy with the enforcement activities and less busy in jail? The agency promotes a model of policing called community capitals policing, which focuses on building human capital, social capital, political capital, natural capital, so green spaces, for example, built capital, financial capital, and cultural capitals within the county and among their residents. there's a picture of Dig Deep Farms, which was one of the early efforts ACSO pursued in the idea of being more preventative. It grew out of an effort to get youth in the county lockup outdoors more. The first Dig Deep Farms facility was actually on the footprint of the county jail, but has turned into a commercial growing operation, and they're developing a food distribution facility associated with Dig Deep Farms. Another highlight in the community capitals policing work was the building and opening of the Reach Ashland Youth Center, which is a state-of-the-art community facility that is in Ashland, and it was built with funding captured by the Deputy Sheriff's Activities Lead. I want to talk about Eden Night Live, which is a later effort, and starting in 2015, really to develop, again, that economic capital and social capital in the neighborhood. It was pursued with support from the Department of Justice, Community-Based Crime Reduction Program, and ArtPlace America. The focus is on building community cohesion, improving police-community relations, and providing markets for local businesses, especially food trucks. It was a weekly, in the summer and winter, community festival and fair, generally on Friday and Saturday nights. Developing the space for Eden Night Live was provided by the work to create the space provided by the sheriff's deputies. And the idea was to have this community fair space activation through creative placemaking, and in that way build community, build the social cohesion within the community, and collective efficacy as people met together and got to know one another. Again, the idea that Eden Night Live was to be used to build relationships. We have a picture of the DSAL staff working on kind of the central point of the Eden Night Live space. And again, the success is measured in a lot of ways for Eden Night Live, but it's a way to think outside the box and address what had been a blighted lot and make it a centerpiece of the community. So I think this picture at the end I wanted to highlight for two reasons. First is that in trying to find kind of innovative and creative ways to address crime, it's important to recognize potential assets in your community. This is a main commercial corridor that essentially had a vacant, disused lot on it that most people wouldn't have recognized as a possible community asset. But it turned out that all it took was the vision. The second part is the need to build a coalition of support. What you see is the lazy river painting that had been done as part of Eden Night Live. Unfortunately, the space was not controlled by the sheriff's office. It was controlled by a planning board that wanted to see commercial development on the site. So Eden Night Live in this space was only temporary, and the sheriff's office was not able to build enough political support to interrupt what the other plans were for the site. They've had to move Eden Night Live, but they were able to move it. They've also seen, as a result of kind of the public involvement, greater participation by community groups in crime prevention efforts, and see it as a big success. So that's LISC Safety and Justice's approach, and some ideas for how to use space and how to recognize space as an asset and potential way to reduce crime. I want to turn it over now to my colleague Bess Earl, who is with the Milwaukee LISC office currently, but she was a community partner on a crime reduction project in the neighborhood of Washington Park, working with United Methodist Children's Services in Milwaukee as a partner to LISC, Milwaukee PD, and others. And she can talk more specifically about how at the local level LISC can work with sites to reduce crime. Bess?
Great. Thanks, Matt. As Matt mentioned, so I did work prior to joining LISC in the Washington Park neighborhood. So I am going to talk just a little bit about my current role at LISC Milwaukee, and then I'm going to go deeper into my involvement in Washington Park. I also want to say, while place is very important, we also recognize that the partners and especially residents that are working in neighborhoods are crucial to any kind of success for reducing crime. With that, we'll get started. LISC Milwaukee has a framework of equitable economic development, and we recognize within that strategy that we want to support neighborhoods that are safe. And so with that, we really look at promoting positive collaborations. It's hard work. It's not always easy. And so we, in partnership with a local nonprofit here in Milwaukee, host the Crime Prevention Awards, and that was just in its 70th year. We also support collaborations through trainings and technical assistance and also funding. So we were unique in the fact that we were one of, I think, the only sites in the country to receive an actual grant from, and I'm talking about LISC Milwaukee, to receive a grant from a police department for a portion of staff salary to focus on building better alignment between community organizations, police, prosecutors, probation, and parole agents, and other stakeholders. At the time, our assistant chief said in the early 90s, they had looked at partnership with community as we will tell you what we're doing to you. They learned that that didn't work, and then they transitioned into, we have a strategy, what do you think? That didn't really work, and so it was, how do we come to a table together to talk about safety and reduce crime collaboratively? So while we had that grant with the police, we were able, the LISC local office was able to support 3 neighborhoods receiving national recognition through the MetLife Foundation. In 2012, the Milwaukee Police Department received the Washington Park Burn Criminal Justice Innovation Grant, now known as Innovations for Community-Based Crime Reduction. And we also received in 2016 another grant through CBCR to work with the police department in another neighborhood here in Milwaukee. And the effectiveness of the Washington Park grant was that it actually served as a model for a privately funded 3-year, $1.5 million public safety initiative here in Milwaukee. So at the core of the Washington Park burn grant was really the cross-sector partnerships. But I want to go into just a little bit of the background on why Washington Park itself was selected. We had, prior to receiving the grant, worked through a neighborhood plan or a quality of life plan in partnership with LISC and other partners and residents. We created a 5-year action plan with 7, and that formed 7 committees. One of them included public safety. So prior to receiving the grant, we had already had some systems in place to support a grant around public safety. And I think that when I look at Milwaukee and other neighborhoods that have worked really closely with law enforcement, some of the success is already having a plan in place. That second neighborhood that I mentioned earlier that received a federal grant to partner with the police department. had a neighborhood plan, and then the private model that I mentioned, that was the $1.5 million initiative, also had a neighborhood plan prior to their partnership. So the grant really aimed to improve public safety by relationship building and collaborative problem solving, support enhanced law enforcement activities, and community activities that encourage neighborliness. So it wasn't just crime and safety meetings, but when we had art festivals, one of the goals was to reduce the amount of prostitution on a commercial corridor. And so we had artists, we realized we had a very large concentration of artists in our neighborhood, and so to promote an asset and celebrate the neighbors and their talents, we shut down the corridor, had a festival, and then we invited the police department to serve ice cream to residents that gathered. We also, through LISC, when we talk about cross-sector partnerships, we had also organized a training for artists, organizers that represent the residents, and law enforcement to look at how place, again, can impact crime. And so they looked at creative placemaking and crime prevention through environmental design, and then teams of groups would go into the neighborhood, do site audits. And it was really powerful just to see the different angles that the cross-sector partners had in their approach for reducing crime. One partner that we were really fortunate to have in Washington Park was Habitat for Humanity. They had, prior to their partnership in Washington Park, been a citywide housing developer to support homeowners, and realized that they really needed to concentrate their construction in one neighborhood at a time. They recognized that we had a strong neighborhood plan, we had residents engaged, and then we had just received the Washington Park BCGI grant. And so the first year that they developed was actually in 2013, and they built all over the neighborhood and realized that they needed to even go more local and more concentrated. And so in 2014, they started building within a 4-block radius. And how they selected that area was not just, it was actually based on the neighborhood had been doing housing surveys, so physical housing surveys in which there was a recognition for what resources homeowners needed, what resources investor owners needed, and also where were there opportunities for development, and then paired that information that was resident-driven by also talking to the police department about where are some of the highest areas of concentration of crime, where would you like to see development, and so they based their areas on that. And what was really powerful is that the local district of the police department actually was building homes alongside the new homeowners. So these are just a couple of tools. I think, again, really when people are done working, if they don't live there, the anchors in the neighborhood are really the residents. And so how do you support residents, partnership, in addressing crime? And I think the first is making sure that residents are organized. We were really successful in Washington Park in sending monthly letters to all of the homeowners and contacts that we had built over the 5 years that we had been working there. We also did something called a resident appreciation breakfast where staff cooked the meals. Law enforcement were invited. There was no agenda except just to get to know your neighbors and thank residents and the partners for coming to all of the meetings that we had, for showing up, for caring about their neighborhood. And then I think talking about just really quickly the SEBTAD audits, the crime prevention through environmental design, we organized as the Washington Park partners the actual walks based on where residents were having concerns. And then residents and law enforcement did the audits together, and it was, again, a really powerful tool. Residents would come with their clipboards and just walk down, learn some things from law enforcement, and also be able to share their perspective. The law enforcement was also learning from residents. I'm going to talk a little bit more about good business agreements in the next slide, but I wanted to say another really takeaway from the work that we did in Washington Park was that when we had our crime and safety meetings on a monthly basis, we noticed that residents were sitting on one side of the room and law enforcement was sitting on the other. So we switched the format of the meeting to be that based on geographic location in the neighborhood, we would invite residents to sit with one another and then ask law enforcement to split up and each go to an area to sit with different neighbors. And then the residents, instead of, again, us setting the agenda for the meetings, they were able then to talk about some of the problems that they were having in a hyper-local area. And we had, through the Burn Criminal Justice Innovation Grant, community improvement project dollars. So then residents and law enforcement were able to think through what kind of projects, events, activities would be best in those areas. And so we saw some really great projects through that. So a good business agreement, it's a local and national tool. It's on LISC National's website. It's not a legally binding document, but neighbors can use it to hold standards for the kind of businesses that they want to see in their neighborhood. These are some of the issues. You can read the slide of how or what issues can be addressed in a good business agreement. One example was in Washington Park with TOBRUK. It was a convenience store. On the left is the before, on the right is the after. We had, as Washington Park partners, sent letters to the business letting them know what resources were available. We had the district attorney's office sending letters on their letterheads stating that residents had cited these problems as an issue. But what ultimately got the convenience store to change their facade was that residents brought the unsigned good business agreement to a license committee and also documented what kind of activity was taking place inside and outside of the property affecting their quality of life. And the license committee actually suspended the license for 60 days until the business added windows, signed the good business agreement, removed blunt wraps from the countertop, et cetera, changed the signage. And so the business invested $7,000 into the actual property. Another example is through the most recent, now known as, again, the Innovations for Community-Based Crime Reductions through S&S Liquor. The picture on the right just shows that a big element of crime prevention through environmental design is eyes on the street and territorial reinforcement. And you can see that there's only one property that's actually owner-occupied, and the rest are all vacant properties and city-owned lots. And so the partners at the table created pop-up events for people to come and do something positive, as well as we created a good business agreement. The residents in the area took that to the licensing committee. We did sub-TED trainings for residents on what kind of improvements would they like to see on some of those city-owned lots. We made slow-down signs, and then we also did a lighting project. So with that, I will turn it over to the moderator for questions.
Thanks, Beth. Great presentation. We have a couple questions that came in. The first I'll take, but then I'd like you to respond to as well. Suzanne Vargas asks, working for a neighborhood organization, how would you suggest that one tries to get something going in our city, which is Dallas? I think the first thing that you'll want to do is start establishing the relationships that will let you do cross-sector work and trying to identify specific problems that you'd like to work on. So, for example, in terms of establishing relationships, you're probably already well connected with other neighborhood organizations, but building out on that capacity and then approaching the local police department, Dallas Police Department, and you'll want to approach them in a couple different ways. First, you'll want to establish relationships with your local district commander and command staff, because that is going to be the person responsible for crime in your area. If there's a community policing division, you'll want to reach out to those folks and establish relationships. You may have a community policing officer who's responsible for working or multiple community policing officers responsible for working in your neighborhood. And also, organizationally, it's good to try and establish relationships with the chief's office, though the caveat for if you do that is you have to respect the chain of command within a police department. It's a very militaristic organization. So if you have a concern with something at the district command level, you don't go to the chief's office because that can really damage relationships. And, you know, kind of an other ever-present issue working with police organizations is that people move around quite a bit. So you want to establish relationships with the institution as much as you can and not just with individual people, though you will certainly find as you try and work with the police department that some of the officers are really into working with community groups, and you'll want to hold on to them for as long as you can, but they will move away. So reaching out to those people within a police department, asking them the simple question of what can we do to help you in reducing crime? And again, there's a benefit to trying to solve specific problems, especially if they're place-based, which can get you out of that dynamic of targeting people in the neighborhood and the concerns about whether targeting people is fair or unfair. But let's concentrate on something where we can work together and think about a place. Our experience is that when people work together and listen to each other and respect their priorities, then the relationship builds. And you working for a neighborhood organization can help facilitate some healing around police community divides in your role as honest broker and representing the needs of the residents in your neighborhood and having that role. So, Bess, any advice for somebody who wants to start working with their local law enforcement agency?
Yeah, I would say that, again, a key element really is also involving the residents in that partnership. I'm sorry. So a couple of things I would recommend is, one, just looking at what is, I think that there is, in my experience working in Washington Park, there was frustration with, here in Milwaukee, if you call a property, if you call in on a property 3 times, they are deemed as an 80-10 nuisance, and that qualifies law enforcement to then have a follow-up conversation with the property owner and bring them into the district to figure out what they're going to do to support a high quality of life in neighborhoods. And there was a disconnect in which we were telling residents that actually if you call in 3 times, it can't be on the problem was that you couldn't call 3 times on the same incident. It had to actually be 3 separate incidents. And so really being a broker for any kind of communication, I think between law enforcement and residents is a really critical role, and that can lead to some small wins. And so I think reinforcing those small wins is critical. And the final piece that I would also recommend is when you're starting these partnerships, you need that resident story and experience, and also engaging both law enforcement and residents in analyzing any kind of available data to help build that story, because I think there's a role that we all play. And like Matt said, there's a lot of finessing of relationships that needs to take place when you're working with law enforcement, but making sure that you can also then equip residents so that they're civically engaged, that they can be talking to their elected officials, not only about their personal experience, but backing that with data, I think is really critical as well.
Yeah, thanks. And another question, let's see, can't quite see the name of the person who asked it, but the question is, the good business agreement model sounds interesting, especially in high-density areas where businesses like liquor stores, vape shops are grandfathered in because of zoning. How do you get that buy-in from the business owners? What is the incentive for them? And again, I'll go first and then ask Bess to comment, because I had made a note as Bess was talking to talk about TOBRUK Foods as an example of something that can only be done with a broad partnership, right? So in order to, if you're thinking about an initiative like that as having a carrot and a stick, TOBRUK Foods only had to worry because the neighborhood was organized around the problems that they created. They put pressure on the licensing commission. They worked with police, and they were able to present an option to the store essentially as a united front to say, this is what you're going to do, or there are going to be bad consequences. But also I think it's helpful to recognize in dealing, especially with businesses, that they're in business for a reason, right? They probably want their store to, operate in a better way if they feel like it's something that they can achieve and that won't send them out of business. So we find in a number of the sites we work with, it's helpful, for example, if you want a business to do a facade improvement, to be able to contribute some money, not all of it, but some money to that as an incentive to the business owners. Bess, thoughts?
No, I think you answered that well.
Yeah, and, another example not related to kind of the good neighbor agreements about having the right people at the table, working in the Rainier Beach neighborhood in Seattle, they had a problem with fights among middle schoolers on their commute home. And what would happen is middle schools already had staggered release times, but the transit schedules were such that they all arrived at the transit station at the same time, and that's when the fights would happen. Because school administrators were at the table with the crime reduction partnership, it became a very easy fix. The principal said, well, I can just adjust the schedule a little to take into account the transit routes, too. Let's see, additional questions? Sorry, just reading through, we got a bunch in the last couple minutes. So we have two questions that relate to the idea of gentrification. One from Isabel Salas is, one big concern with things like this are fears of gentrification and displacement. And then another question from Kelvin Body. In the Housing and Community Development Network of New Jersey, I may imagine there may be some initial hesitancies of the collaboration between police and community. Oh, sorry, wrong question. But there was another question on gentrification. I would say that safety work in and of itself, probably, in my experience, concerns around gentrification already exist before safety work happens because it's based more on economic factors that are happening in a neighborhood, so that becoming a safer place in and of itself generally is not going to be driving that. We certainly run into concerns around gentrification, but it's in cities where that tends to be a concern already. I don't know if Milwaukee had those issues in Washington Park, Bess, or in any of the neighborhoods you're working in?
Yeah, I think that's I wish that we could talk about this for longer, so I'll try to be as brief as I can. I think, one, it was really helpful for us to partner with Habitat for Humanity through our work around public safety, since they were supporting opportunities that were affordable for home ownership. The second thing is, I mentioned that we were doing housing inventory surveys, and we, again, identified available housing resources for existing homeowners and created something called a neighborhood improvement district, where we set aside a pool of funds, I think it was about $70,000 a year, for existing homeowners to be able to apply to improve their homes. that did two things. One, tax delinquency and code violations, I think, are a major issue, especially that what we experienced in Washington Park, which can then cause a homeowner to lose their home and create a greater risk of displacement and gentrification. And so staying on top of, again, the data that you have, knowing how are your homeowners and renters doing, and around tax delinquency and, again, code violations, I think is really critical to that question.
Great. And did you want to add more?
I wish I could, but I've gotten a lot of really good questions.
Yeah.
I'm happy to share my contact information if people want to follow up on how Milwaukee's done the housing surveys and some of the work that we did with the city to create pools of funds for existing homeowners that I think help them stay in their homes.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and I think Center for Community Progress will be providing that information to everybody. We have another two questions, which I think they may not seem related, but to me they are. The first is, how do you get through initial hesitancies of collaboration between police and communities, especially those that have experienced trauma through the criminal justice system? And another question about how do you facilitate conversations between immigrant communities and police departments? I think our experience is this is why it's so important to have those community groups, the honest brokers in the community that can help facilitate those discussions and provide something of a buffer, especially in the early stages. I think what we've found in most of the places we've worked is that once you're able to get to the point of working together on specific problems, that tends to help conversations, and those conversations build on one another. The police and working with communities have the natural advantage of when you're in trouble on call, they're the ones who show up and try to help you. Obviously that happens or that doesn't happen in the way we would want some of the time, but most of the officers you're going to deal with, they'll have gotten into policing for exactly the reasons you think somebody would, to help people. And so when they're able actually to work on projects where they have interactions with people and get feedback and get to see the impact of their work on a community, it can make their job much better as well. So we find a lot of police officers actually hunger for this type of work. And community members, I think for me the most satisfying efforts are the ones where residents and community members start to feel that sense of empowerment around their community, like we can actually impact the place we live, we can learn how to get things done through the city, and we are in control of our neighborhoods. So,
just
yep.
To add to that, and I, again, wish we had more time to talk about it, but I think a good follow-up for Matt would be that there is just make it, first of all, what residents experience is real, and that needs to be acknowledged. And second, I think when we saw good work happening in Washington Park, the national story and reality also impacted what was happening at a local level. So I think, again, making sure that when there are wins, celebrating those, and I think as a nonprofit or partner in the neighborhood, through your newsletter, contacting the media outlets to try to get those stories shared is important. And then I think organizations like LISC, whether or not you have a LISC, even just trying to see if you can get a hold of the national LISC support. There was programming done in Cleveland, Ohio, around policing the young brain, and I think that was really effective. And that was something that the national LISC was involved in as well.
Hey, Bess.
Yeah.
Can you just
go ahead?
I was just asking if Bess could just briefly repeat that first part of her response, only because it kind of broke up a little bit.
Sorry.
That would be great.
I just said that first, that what residents experience is real, and that needs to be acknowledged in the work that we all do. So yeah, that was it.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's important to recognize as neighborhood organizations your potential role, not as cheerleader for the police, right, but also as advocate for your residents, and being able to come in and stake out some boundaries for a partnership like this. You don't want, for example, the police department will want to work on the problems they want to work on, which oftentimes are not what is of concern to the residents. So there has to be a definite discussion, and that's something that you can facilitate about what's important. They're going to focus on high-profile, high violent crimes and things like that, and for many of your residents, quality of life issues are going to be more important. So making sure that you can step into that role and facilitate that conversation and advocate for your neighborhood.
So I'm going to wrap us up. We're a little bit over, but I just want to thank everybody for coming today. I want to thank our speakers. I just want to remind everybody that, we hope you'll join us on July 25th for our next Cornerstone webinar, and that you can go to our website to find more information on this and upcoming webinars. Finally, I just want to add that we will share a recording of today's presentation as well as the slides, an email that will go out in the next couple of days once everything has been downloaded and finalized. Thanks, and have a great afternoon.